Hello, my name is Peter Cinnamon, and you're very welcome to a podcast which is all about the Irish League. And there's only one story dominating the podcast this week. After almost 2 decades in charge, manager Stephen Baxter has announced his shock impending departure from Crusaders. We're going to cover the fallout of this story from all angles, reflect on what his legacy will be in North Belfast, the almost immeasurable impact he's had on the Shore Road club. We'll take a look at the influence he's had on the league as a whole, ask if his time as an Irish League football manager might be over. We'll ponder some of the potential candidates to be his successor and review what kind of task they may have on their hands in rebuilding the Cruise. We'll also do a recap of what was a rather eventful Irish Cup 6th round, look ahead to this weekend's top flight fixtures, all in this jam-packed weekly edition of Kicking Match. Sometimes episodes like this one can be some of the more easier ones to do. There's so much to talk about, so many interesting nuggets you want to share. On the other hand, they can be pretty daunting. And when news as significant as one of the longest serving, for me, most successful managers in league history announces their intention to step away from a club which many would consider they're just a part of the fabric there, that's a pretty big deal. So it's my intention, which is probably no surprise to yourself, to give this story a bit of time this week, and with the aim of doing it as much justice as I can, I brought in someone who can cover all of the bases of Stephen Baxter's time in the Seaview hot seat. It is an absolute pleasure to have football writer and reporter Barry Flynn back on the pod. Hello, how are you?
Good evening, Peter. I hope you're well.
I'm doing very, very well. And, let's just open the can up here. I was at a game preparing on Saturday afternoon for the Irish Cup, as were you. And as I connected all my gear, started to take my notes, the news filtered through. Stephen Baxter is set to step away from his role as manager of Crusaders. And it was one of those things where it was quite surprising and it took me off guard ever so slightly. But when news like that comes, it often brings up so many questions. So there's a lot to get into here. He isn't gone yet, but when you saw it that he was going to leave, were you surprised?
Well, bit like yourself, I was setting up and I was flicking through Twitter and I saw the tweet from Crusaders and it said statement on behalf of the board, and I thought, my goodness, this is could be groundbreaking. And when I opened it up, I went, my God, what? Stephen Baxter reminded me of the time that David Jeffrey decided to step away from Linfield, which was on a Saturday as well. But Stephen Baxter and Crusaders, for as long as I've been doing football, he's been there. He's part and parcel of Seaview. The passion the guy has exuded for that club, the journey he has brought that club on since 2005. It's phenomenal, the trophies he's delivered. But yeah, I was a bit shocked at it, saying, my goodness, he's walking away. This is the end, truly, of an era. But, I looked into it and I began to think about it, Peter, and I thought back because Joel Taggart did interview him the previous Saturday. That was the game against Glentoran. They had a goal disallowed, very controversially, and they had a penalty not given, so Glentoran came away with the points. But afterwards, Peter, Stephen was talking about the referee, and he says the referee makes those decisions. They will go home at night and they will be able to move on with their lives. But he said, interestingly, look, I'll go home and will not be able to speak now for 3 days. And even after 19 years in management of one club, that illustrates the pressure and the impact, the human impact that a defeat at Seaview would have on Stephen Baxter, a driven individual. Maybe he couldn't speak to people for 3 days, and maybe that was, he went and thought about, this whole pressure of being a manager and needing to get into Europe every year to keep the heads above water. And after so many years, he's just decided, that's it, I've had enough. And everybody in life will make that decision, cross the Rubicon, and Stephen has thought about the pressure and he's walked away from the club at the end of this season. And what a legacy he leaves behind. But I think it's an indictment too on the pressures on modern day managers in local soccer.
He has been part and parcel with Crusaders for close to 2 decades. We saw that stat maybe a season or two ago that he is claimed to be the longest serving manager in world football. And he is very much an anomaly in that case. Like 20 years is a long time in life, forget football. And with a team like Crusaders, to see the journey he took them on, of course, he was a part of that great side in the 90s, which were champions. And then they very much fell away at the end of that decade. And then he was given his chance to take the reins. It didn't work out. They got relegated, and then they went back up, and that was a part of what seemed like a continued ascendancy. I mean, you look back at even just Seaview back during his first season as manager. It doesn't even look like itself. You know that the ground has changed, the team has changed, and he leaves an incredible mark not just on Crusaders but across the Irish League. You know, people talk about big characters in football in Northern Ireland. He has been and is one of them.
Look, Stephen brought that side. I mean, you look at Seaview, it's a totally transformed club. It's a different world to what Stephen came into. They were a team in the doldrums. David Jeffrey mentioned that on Saturday. Where he's been, one thing that sticks out for me is that Setanta Cup win in 2012 at the Oval. But to me, Stephen Baxter, the time that they won the league at Solitude, and he went down to the Crusaders fans and actually climbed up onto the fence. And I think the fence was actually broken. And I remember going back the next season and there was still a broken bit in the fence. I thought, there's Stephen Baxter. That's how much he wanted to share that victory with the fans, that he actually climbed up onto the fence. He was adored by those fans. He delivered, punched way above Crusaders' weight. They and Cliftonville, 10 years ago, were the big two in Belfast. But it's like everything in life, Peter. Everything has a natural lifespan, and nothing lasts forever. And he's had a poor enough season by his own standards, and he's taken this decision. But for so long, Stephen was the top of the pile when it came to the managerial roles in the local soccer. He exuded passion for the game. I've seen him coming in to confront people in the stand at Seaview a few times who were giving unwarranted criticism of the team at the end of a game. He bled Crusaders. He bled black and red. And it's going to be so different without him there, because he was a permanent feature at Seaview. He transformed that club, and everything has its natural end. And Stephen not being there next season will be a very strange place, Seaview, to visit.
It's funny, you never truly know that you are out of an era until probably a couple of years later. And we're very much now right in the middle of this ascension to full-time football, or teams becoming full-time, and we're not quite sure where that will lead us long term. But we go back to that era of the 2010s, and we're just off the back of, from the 2000s, pretty much Linfield dominating. There was a title for Portadown, title for Glentoran, but I mean, it was this immense run led by David Jeffrey. And as you alluded to there, right slap bang in the middle of the 2010s, there was this revival in North Belfast where Cliftonville win the league twice, and then Crusaders finally rise up and are able to claim their own Gibson Cup, the first one in the guts of 2 decades, if not more. And looking back, what's so impressive about it, really, not only the fact that they won the championship, which we've seen with Larne and others, or even Glentoran recently, like the last time they won is well over a decade ago, almost 15 years ago in 2009. To get there was an achievement for a club the size of Crusaders, and yes, they were able to grow that club. But 3 titles out of 4 years, that is immense. It was all led by him. He built that team. It didn't happen overnight, but he was the center point of it all. He was the focus. He tinkered, he built, and he was the true leader of that team.
Very shrewd. I mean, you talk about tactically aware. He was the brains on and off the field, some of the signings he made, but ultimately it's the trophies that he won. And I mean, right up to the Irish Cups that he was able to take, in the last number of years. But that season, or those seasons, when the Crusaders and Cliftonville were going at it hammer and tongs, that was so exciting for local soccer. And Stephen was head and shoulders above his, counterparts at that stage. And we think back to the years before, whenever Linfield used to run away with the league by Easter. But what Crusaders, Cliftonville, and all the rest of the sides gave us during that little golden period, and Stephen was the leader there, it'd be hard to buy that back. You look at Glentoran, they would love to have achieved half of what Stephen has in the last 10 years. But talking about Stephen, I remember Stephen as a footballer playing for Linfield Crusaders, and he was some goal scorer in his day, and it was like a seamless transition into management that Stephen went into, took up the reins of Crusaders. You always knew that the cream will rise to the top, and Stephen with Crusaders, it took a couple of years, but you'll not. It'll be very difficult to top what he achieved with those leagues and cups. And whoever's coming in to fill those shoes, it's going to be, they're going to be judged on the benchmark. It was Stephen Baxter.
He was and is a manager with such personality, but you could see that personality in his teams. We all joke about it as fans of the Irish League, be it a real Crusaders team, from the teams that were incredibly successful to the teams that have broadly been winners for the guts of his tenure there. They've all been battling. There have always been physical sides that are able to have little sparky stars flourish. It was a team he put out there and always up for a fight.
Yeah, definitely. I always think of Colin Coates in the centre of that defence. He just personified Stephen Baxter to me. And the way Crusaders used to play under Baxter, you knew there was always going to be a plan B if it wasn't working out. They were unbeatable at Seaview for many years, and I used to go along and report. You always knew the Crusaders would come away with a 2-0 or a 3-0 victory because they were tight at the back and they had those options up front, speedy wingers, everything. But that was all down to the guy at the sideline, with tactically aware, knowing exactly that Seaview was going to be a fortress. And that's what he made Crusaders more or less impregnable at Seaview. And then when they brought that form away from home, the leagues and the cups just followed. So, I mean, I don't know. I think that when we're looking back, there was a lot of accolades in the papers today, a lot of listing about what Stephen achieved. But I think it'll take at least a year or two before people really look back, because this is a golden era that he oversaw for Crusaders. And may they yearn for those glory days to come back, because one poor season or one indifferent season is not going to sum up Stephen Baxter's management of that club. And it just shows you, as I say, we go back to Peter, the pressure, the unrelenting pressure that must be there to produce Saturday in and Saturday out. And if you're coming away on a Saturday after a defeat, and that's going to impact on you and your personality right through into the next week, you have to say there's something better than football. There is more to this life than football. And Stephen obviously sees that.
You can see the pressure for many managers that even this season they've talked about it, from Gary Boyle. We saw Gary Hamilton a couple of weeks ago talking about taking his child away from a game, them in tears from what has been said from the stands. And as well as that, I don't think you get to be a manager at the level of top flight Irish League football unless you're a competitor, unless you have that want to win. And if you have that belief in fighting you when you don't win, that's oftentimes that can be the real difficulty. In turn, to have consistent success is the hardest thing in all of sport. And there's many facets to an amazing manager. It's the ability to motivate, it's the ability to set teams out, but it's also to build these teams. His success was spotting players. Like, when I think of those Crusader sides led by Baxter, Con Coates is a clear one. I think of Morrow in midfield. Heatley's been a star for over a decade. Jordan Owens, David Rainey. He was able to keep these sides, as well as all the young players, which then had to move on. The Gavin Whites, the Stuart Dallases. I mean, these are players that he developed and was able to keep around broadly. He was able to attract the likes of BJ Burns to that project, and they stayed loyal to him. And if you look at the side now, perhaps we are looking at a situation that has been talked about in this podcast now from a team building point of view. He was able to create this excellent team who stayed loyal to him, and with that brought success. But there is a shelf life for every player. You can only play up to a certain point. Someday your number will be called. And you look at that team, and I'm sure plenty of them will feel as though they've got seasons still in them. But it was a side that was trying to squeeze the last bit of juice out of the sides that ran the league close, 2 Irish Cups in a row. Was the enormity of that project, after everything that he has achieved, was that a consideration going, you know what, it's going to take maybe a couple of years to get where I want to be with this team week in and week out? Because you look at that side right now, and there's great players in it who have had immense success in the league, but it's a team that is going to go through transition. How long that transition might be, we don't know. And of course, the other question is, we can talk about transition as if it's this guaranteed thing. It's not. It's a gamble. Everything changes. And the future for Crusaders was uncertain, regardless of if Baxter was at the helm. With him not now going to be at the helm come the start of next season, it's just a very uncertain time for the Cruise.
It is actually, looking back, you talk about Gary Boyle. I interviewed Gary within minutes of him handing in his resignation at Newry, and he was like a ghost. I mean, the pressure had told, and he had just had enough. Now, there was never an expectation at the showgrounds, a very little expectation, perhaps maybe survive in the league. But Stephen had created a magnificent legacy, or he has created a legacy there, because of all the titles and the silverware he's brought to that club. You're constantly trying to emulate that and keep Crusaders in that top 3-4 of local football. But my problem is, and I look at it, and I look at Oran Kearney, and I look at other managers, who have brought so much to the clubs and have brought so much joy to the terraces. Everybody in life is going to go through a transition. Everything is not perfect. But the patience of fans, and you're constantly thinking about the boardroom, it's not going to happen year in, year out. If there's a bad season or a poor season and a team's in transition, people should just say that's a natural part of life. You have your highs, you have your lows, and in order to get back on the highs again, you need to create that. To me, Stephen Baxter was the man that would be able to bring Crusaders back to where they were a number of years ago. But it's the unrelenting pressure, Peter, to succeed, to every year get the club into Europe, because that is essentially the money. I think back, do you remember the European playoff at Solitude, where it was a penalty shootout, 2021, and the ball went over the line, but the linesman didn't see it, and that meant that there was no European adventure for Crusaders that year. And I remember Stephen getting interviewed after that, and he was very magnanimous about everybody can make a mistake and whatever. But the implications to Crusaders as a club by not getting to Europe, I'm sure Stephen went home and that gutted him, that an error such as that, and we all saw it on TV, it was over the line, but the linesman didn't see it. Something, the fine margins that impacted upon the general well-being of that club and the financial clout of that club, was something that ultimately he had to sort of carry the can for, but it was outside his control. And those were the type of pressures, unrelenting pressures, that I think eventually built up and influence this decision. But sometimes there's just too much pressure and stress and anxiety involved, and no matter what your personality, it'll get to you. The managers I have spoken to over the years, on a Saturday, usually after they have won, they enjoy their weekend, but a defeat or a draw is one of the toughest Sundays and Mondays that you can actually endure.
That is a really good point. It's a sliding doors moment for Crusaders. There's no doubt they were able to go on and win the Irish Cup. So it's not like that they didn't return to Europe, but one that I'm sure you would chat to a fan base. And I guess there's similarities here. We don't know where Crusaders will progress to, but Portadown and Linfield are the two teams I think of in regards to long-serving managers. Linfield having to transition from David Jeffrey, Portadown transitioning from Ronnie McFall, who was there for, was it almost 30 years? And you talk about Michael Ruddy, who missed that penalty, or actually did miss the penalty, but just wasn't adjudged to have crossed the line, and that and that is a lot of money that didn't go their way. I know if you talk to many Portadown fans and you see how that club went from being relatively competitive at the top of the league, fairly standard top six side. Then they fell away, got relegated, and have never really come back to be a steady Premiership side. Bar the one time they stayed up in, we're talking maybe 6, 7 years. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen to the Crusaders, but when you're fighting at the top of the league and you've got these margins of error, Portland fans would talk about the Irish Cup in 2015 where they didn't win that against Glentoran. There was a controversial decision with a penalty with Michael Galt. And if that had been scored, Portland get through. Could they have continued on? You know, it's sliding doors. Would they have got the money next season, sides, whatever? That hasn't been the case for Crusaders. There's no guarantee that they're going to get European football this season. In fact, that is now the real goal. But for Crusaders, who have been able to battle now in the contemporary Irish League, where we have Linfield full-time, Glens full-time, big investment for those sides as well. Larne have come in, Cliftonville are there battling in this model. Crusaders have transitioned to this. They've never been able to go full-time completely. They've been in this, was it 3/4, 2/3 model that they've said. I can't imagine, and I haven't seen their books, that is something that they can absolutely guarantee year in and year out without success, without money coming from Europe. So that's a big pressure, isn't it, when you perhaps don't have a lot of slippage and the gap's not there. It's not just about being successful, it's about the entire short-term future of the club could be on the line, and then how do you pivot from there?
Yeah, obviously, to go into certain models for football management or for clubs, there's a baseline about how much money needs to come in every year in order to maintain that. And evidently, the money that was coming in from Europe was sustaining it to a greater or lesser extent. But the uncertainty that creates, that this season, if you do this or get into Europe, you will be able to, for the next season, maintain that model. But at the same time, if you don't get into Europe, or you don't, whatever, sell players, you're going to have to go back to whatever status you had beforehand. So as a business plan, if you were to turn around and say, for the next 10 years, we will try that, but it's all conditional about how they perform one season, how that will affect the model for the next season. And, that Stephen came and he's gone full time. He went full time with Crusaders, but you look at it, everything's short-termism within local soccer. You haven't got the big support, for example, that Larne have, financial clout coming in there. Cliftonville, to me, are a bit like Crusaders. They would love to be able to go, but it is, professional, but it is dependent on having that long-term luxury of knowing you could try this for 5 or 6 years, and that there's a baseline of finance there. But to me, it's that, I hate to say it yet again, that unrelenting Saturday to Saturday pressure about getting results, and actually you lose a game because of poor refereeing or whatever, and it leads you to have that sort of moment that it impacts on your life, impacts on your week, and it's really not a healthy way to be. But maybe that's just a reflection on local soccer, because they talk about teams going professional. That's all great and well in some utopian society, but I can tell you there are teams that are capable of it and teams that will never do it in that Premier League, because the resources are just not there, and Crusaders are in that little limbo where they just don't have that underpinning finance to give them that longer term business plan.
Now that his time as Crusaders manager is set to come to an end, we can look back on it. There could be one final twist in the tail for you, Barry. And look, you've been following football and you've been writing about football and reporting on football pretty much his entire tenure as boss of Crusaders. For me, he ranks as arguably the best Irish League manager of the 21st century. I think it's pretty much between him and David Jeffrey. Very different situations. But looking back at his tenure, what do you think is his crowning achievement? Is it the league titles? Is it the Setanta? Is it building up the Cruise? What's his real legacy?
Personally, you're the manager of Linfield, you're expected to win the league every year. Okay. And ultimately, when you don't deliver that league for Linfield, that's when you become vulnerable. Crusaders were never expected the bookmakers would never have made them favourites to actually win the league titles or win it as many times as they did. But they were so consistent under David Jeffrey. But going back, to me, it has to be the Setanta Cup, the win at the Oval over Derry City. They weren't expected to do that, but they did. They won the All Ireland competition. I think they just come off the back of losing the Irish Cup final. But that bounce back ability, I'd imagine that was actually done in the changing rooms after that Irish Cup final and before the Setanta Cup final, where Stephen Baxter held court. To me, that's where the skill and the knowledge of the guy really came across. And the one thing I would say about Stephen is the absolute respect across the league from managers, administrators, and players. It's I've never heard a bad word said about Stephen Baxter. He walks away from Crusaders with a legacy. He walks away with his head held high. And I think that legacy that Stephen Baxter created during those 19 years will only be appreciated 5, 6 years down the line when people think back about what one guy leading a club like Crusaders achieved, because to me, it's immeasurable. And you're right, he was and is, to me, over the last 20 years, the best manager in Irish League football. Went about it in an unassuming way. He always made himself available for interviews. He was just part of the furniture at Seaview, and he has delivered. And his record is there for all to see. So I think, given the resources he had and what he achieved, he was the best.
We're in what does your gut tell you territory. He's a man that's still under 60. Perhaps he talked about the pressure. He's done what he felt he could do in football management. Crusaders was his club, and he feels as though he's done it all. It might not be straight away, but could you see Stephen Baxter returning to management at some point down the line? Could you even imagine that? Is he done?
Well, basically, 58 is no age. I personally think we haven't heard the end of Stephen. I think there's a big club in East Belfast, maybe at one stage would, that's maybe would be a target. But then you remember Roy Walker went to Glentoran. It never worked out because of the administrative problems. But he's obviously got a plan. He's sat down. He's thinking about life beyond football. Never say never. It could be like David Jeffrey. David has a niche for himself outside football, very well respected, pundit, etc. And he's writing for the Telegraph. Stephen will have no shortage of offers inside or outside the game, but management, as he just said, I can't, this is not I'm not enjoying management. Is there something? Give it a break, year, 18 months, you never know. But it would be an awful loss to managerial and coaching if Stephen was just to leave football.
We haven't touched too much about the timing of this. A part of that is to remove any questions and to just lay it all out and help his team, as he said, prepare now for the next stage, knowing that there's no question marks over it. So it's an interesting, from a timing point of view, what that means. And you're right. My gut tells me he's not done. It might not be straight away, but I don't think he's done. I can see with David Jeffrey, I can see how he perhaps has transitioned. He has achieved so much. He did have a club after his great odyssey with Linfield, and perhaps he feels as though he has done that. And I couldn't see him going into management. For Stephen Baxter, I can see it, and I think that any team in this league, and particularly the ones at the top, if they had a vacancy, he would be number one at the top of the lists. All the fans would be clamouring for him. Perhaps maybe not on the other side of North Belfast, but I mean, he had so much success. I wouldn't be surprised. Say they've got a very successful manager currently in post, but the situation in Glentoran seems movable at any point based on success. I doubt Crusaders fans would want to see it, but I'm sure they would understand if in the next few seasons we see Stephen Baxter on the sidelines of Windsor Park. It would seem mad 5 years ago, but that's football. Things change very, very quickly.
Yeah, you look at the legacy over 19 years. Stephen, as I say, was part of the fabric at Crusaders. If somebody were to approach Stephen, some club, and say, can you come in and do that? It took Stephen a while to actually, get his vision, up on to the playing field, and then that success followed. We live in an age, Peter, where say something happened at Glentoran, they decided they wanted to bring in Stephen. Is he going to be given the time to turn that whole tanker, which is the Oval and Glentoran, around? Success. People want success immediately. And Stephen was allowed to, he was given the time to develop that side at Crusaders. Stephen was the club, in my view, part of the backbone of that club. He was allowed to do his own thing. But you don't know. Is it a thing about management? I thought there's more to life than management. I'm sure it'll all come out. But yeah, he could come back, but will he ever make a success, or will he ever be given the time and space that he had at Crusaders? We live in an immediate gratification society. Managers are brought in for a quick fix, but you're only as good as your last result, unfortunately, in local soccer. And the pressure is unrelenting. There's that word again. And does Stephen want that? That's a good question. Perhaps not.
Naturally, then the questions are already popping up. Who next? Who could it be? And it's not really clear. There's a few names on the free market, and also with Crusaders, their club, and maybe this is just in the image of Stephen Baxter, their club, who felt like they have a clear identity. They're a club that feels like they have a clear way of doing things, and with that, it's not every manager out there, at least for me, could you go, they would automatically fit there in the same way you might say it at other clubs where perhaps they're more malleable. Crusaders are a side who have won, and they've won in a certain way, and I wonder, are we going to see from the board a decision of some form of continuity, trying to keep what they believe is quote unquote the Crusaders way, whatever people may interpret that, or as sometimes we see in a situation like this where you have a lot of success with one way of working, do they pivot? Do they think it's important, in fact, to pivot and go for something completely different? The names that are out on the open market, to quote them, that people would say, you are looking at the likes of perhaps Gary Hamilton. We've seen David Jeffrey. He's obviously on the open market we've talked about, doing his media stuff. Paddy McLaughlin has left Derry. He obviously has connections to Cliftonville. We have the two Shields, father and son, out there. Of those names, talk them one by one. I don't know if there's one that you can see that they fit like for like as a Crusaders boss.
It's very interesting, Peter. I would think that part of the leaving strategy for Stephen will be that there'll be a succession plan, and somebody could be named early as that person who will shadow him for the remaining months of the season, so that there's a smooth handover. Whether the board and Stephen have sat down and says, well, who do you think should be brought in to do this? It's going to be a culture shock to the fans who have been going there for so long. Did I hear the name Declan Cadell mentioned? A sort of in-house sort of, replacement. There are the big names that are out there. There'll be no instant success brought in. It'll be the supporters need to give anybody who comes in that time and space to put their own stamp upon it. But the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking. The name that does spring to mind to me is Gary Hamilton. He did something similar with, well, not to the extent Stephen did. He made Glenavon, brought them to Irish Cup finals, into Europe, etc. That's where he cut his teeth. He's been out of the game for a number of months. Would that be a challenge? Gary's his own man. Gary is, to me, one of the most intelligent managers you could have. He will come in, sit back, he'll observe. If they give him that succession plan, he can look about, and he can put his own stamp on that club. But we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. What resources would a new manager have? Stephen may have worked his own way, had his own mechanisms for bringing players through. So there needs to be that space given to a new manager. And I think the quicker that they would name somebody, the better, because then all that wisdom of Stephen Baxter can be passed on within the next number of months.
There is a list, isn't there? And I guess I'll share some of the views on them. You mentioned Gary Hamilton. He is, I think, the big name on the market because of his success with Glenavon, his success as a player as well. I think there is some sort of twinned kinship, you would say, between Baxter and Hamilton. They're both very sturdy and defiant characters. They're both players who had success on the pitch, were then able to transfer that quite quickly from their time on the pitch to doing it on the sidelines. They both seem to be quite big motivators of like the wheel and deal. What's interesting there is that it just they also feel like very different type of characters, maybe attitudes. You know, Gary has talked quite openly about his opposition to plastic pitches. Has that maybe softened now over the past while? Is there maybe a chalk and cheese with the ethos of Crusaders? Maybe Gary Hamilton, is he too much of a big character in that regard? Talked about Paddy McLaughlin. He was with Cliftonville. Is that the type of manager that they want to bring in after his stint with Derry City? Maybe there's other clubs that are looking for his services, perhaps, and that might be a better fit. David Jeffrey, again, would he want to come in? Is he the type of manager they'd want to bring in for both Kenny and Dean Shields? You know, they're managers who perhaps would be looked at as people who have got to prove themselves again after maybe not the most amount of success recently in their previous jobs. But I have seen out there that fans are looking for a name or someone with proven success to step in there. Elsewhere around the league, I mean, the more successful managers recently has been Dean Smith at Loughgall, but that's a big jump up. Stuart King at Carrick, maybe is he building something? Is that a bit of a big jump for him? Does he fit the culture there? You then look to the internal potential ones, and you say there, I've seen Cadell being talked about. I've also seen people maybe talking about the idea of Peter Thompson, who's a coach there. Could he then step up again? That's a big move up there. But I mean, if you've been sitting there week in and week out with Stephen Baxter on the sideline and you want to create that continuity there, you know, there's plenty of times when people say continuity hasn't worked. But I mean, one of the great local continuity success stories is the late Tommy Breslin, who came in off the back of Eddie Patterson. So you can point in every direction where your theory of who the manager should be has worked and where it hasn't worked. But looking at this club, whoever may take over, what are they taking over? Are they taking over the side who is aiming to win the Premiership next year? I don't think so, because there's going to be a lot of tinkering there. It hasn't worked out this year, so something will have to change. Then, what about the budget? We don't know because of Europe. So they're coming in not only trying to win over all the fans who'll be obviously anxious that their days of being a top of the pile battling for championships side may be coming to an end. But I think it's an attractive job, but it's an attractive job with their work cut out for whoever takes it on, particularly in recruitment, because the main players who have been successful Crusaders in recent years, Heatley, Laurie, Winchester, Forsyth, Tuffy in goals, pretty much that whole back line. I mean, it's 30 and some of them are 30 plus really at the end, and beyond the age of 33, you've seen it can change, it can decline very, very quickly, and every year beyond that age, it's a grace, it's a gift.
Yeah, I mean, for a very long time, Peter, one of the things about Crusaders was that if they were not winning, Jordan Owens was always that option to bring in the long ball game. And on a majority of occasions, it changed the game if Jordan came in the second half or whatever. But you know, you are at that end of an era scenario. The manager's going. So a new manager coming in will need to be probably not ruthless to the extent where he'll have to he'll have to mold a team with new players. How much money's there to bring players in? That is the difficulty that a new manager is going to have to weigh up. The point you make about somebody who's been on the sideline, you know, with Stephen and can think like Stephen does as it being a natural successor. You can see Crusaders keeping it in-house because they are what you would look at. They're a very family-orientated club. Big names from outside may not be, you know, it's a big, big gamble because there's no escaping the sideline there. You're right beside the crowd there in the main stand. But it's a big job because you're right. You have a team that has come to the end of its trophy, its league winning capabilities, and time and space is what is needed to anybody. So that option for the board of keeping it in-house, you've got somebody with that experience. So there's pros and cons to the inside and the external appointment, but you need space, time, and money. And those are the three things, unfortunately, that success is built on now.
Don't be sad that it's over. Just be thankful and happy that it happened. Crusaders are going to be a big story between now and the end of the season, even going in to next year. An era's over, but like most things, sun sets, sun rises again, and the fascinating world of Irish football will continue on. But what a career up in North Belfast. So, after all that, we've got some games that happened over the weekend that we should get into, and we'd want to cover 8 games in the Irish Cup. And let's go straight to the headline coming from those games. We have our final 8 set, and it's 4 of the best sides in the country are set to face off against 4 championship sides. We've all seen giant killings over the years. We've seen success from the championship and below, but I can't remember recently so many teams from below the top flight making it as far and as deep in the competition. And to get this far and deep, a number of them have had to turn over Premiership opposition, and that's exactly what happened on Saturday.
Yeah, it was great because I do the championship most Saturdays on Saturday Sports Sound, and I see teams and players that are, you know what they're capable of, and on a one-to-one battle, the championship sides have really extended themselves, and now we have these quarterfinals. Now the conspiracy theorists, Peter, were up in arms on Saturday when the draw brought us the 4 Premiership clubs against the 4 Championship clubs. It's as if, this marquee day for the Irish Cup final is going to see Linfield against Glentoran or Cliftonville against Larne or something like that there. So we are where we are. I personally was at Institute. They beat Ards 1-0. It wasn't the greatest game in the world. They will take that. And look who they have in the next round, Linfield. So that is ultimately... I was in the changing room on Saturday when the draw came through, and the roars and the cheers from the Institute board and players were amazing to see at the Brandywell. So there you have it. That's the beauty of the Cup.
Check you out, Mr. Flynn, sneaking into changing rooms to be there for all the big moments. You've actually been a part of quite a few big moments for lower teams. You were there for a big part of the Welders run last year. You've been the good luck charm for a couple of these championship teams. I know that was an all championship affair, but
yeah, but I was there last year when the Welders beat Glenavon. We talk about Gary; he was getting an awful abuse about the Welders doing that. But I remember the way that the Welders were playing. It was nil each at halftime. He says, "This team's going to do it." But I'll tell you a funny story, Peter. I was listening outside the changing room to the draw being made live on the radio, and it came out Institute at home, and then Linfield came out. So I went into the changing room, but they were listening on the internet, so they were about 30 seconds behind. So I turned round to Kevin Deary. He says, "You got the Blues?" And he says, "What are you talking about?" And the next thing, the draw mentioned, he says, "Shh, it's Brandywell, we're at home." And I says, "It's Linfield." And he says, "Shush." The next thing was, "We'll play Linfield." So I was 30 seconds ahead of them. So the roar in the stand, it was great. It's occasions like that that really makes the Irish Cup so worthwhile, so brilliant. Some of the other things, I remember the night Annie United beat Glentoran in the League Cup, just being there at a time and a place to see something so joyous as that. But that was a funny story. They wouldn't believe me that they'd got Linfield.
Well, to get 4 sides in the last 8 from the championship, as I alluded to there, it means that there was some championship sides turning over Premiership sides, and the big shocks, if you want to call them that, were by Newington and by Ballyclare beating Newry and Dungannon respectively. Let's start with the game at Stangmore Park. It's not just what football is like week to week. The Swifts go from beating the Blues at Windsor Park, and then the next week they follow up by getting turned over by Ballyclare. Now, you are a man that sees the championship, as you said, pretty much week in and week out. And when you see these results come, it raises this question: What is the gap between particularly the top half of the championship and the bottom half of the Premiership? I think the answer is it's not massive. It's not as big as some people think it is, and probably what it used to be. I think it's shortened.
Yeah, we used to call it the B division back in the bad old days, and they did rebrand it the Premiership and the Championship. To me, there is a gap. The bottom six in the Championship really and truly could be in the Intermediate League, and it's vice versa. You look at Derby, 4 points this year. Um, and also in the Championship, after Christmas is a different story. Dundela are a different team after Christmas because during the transfer window, there was a lot of departures. So it's maintaining that challenge throughout the season. That's why you've got teams like Bangor coming to the fore. And that's why you've teams like Institute, who up in the Northwest there have got a great system for boys coming through to that side. And then, of course, Portadown. Portadown bought so well. But you have to look at Portadown and say to yourself, they don't belong in the Championship. They belong in the Premiership. And I think they will go back there this year. Just look where Niall Curry's brought them after what was, an indifferent start to the season. Was it after the Anna defeat in December? He was pretty blunt. He says there will be people leaving this club, and he has brought other players in. So that is the beauty of a club like Portadown. They would have more resources than some of the others within the Championship, but you look at the way that club has improved. The cup finals they're in, and that Mid-Ulster Cup, believe it or not, I think was the start of a very important process for them this season. And people may look at it and say, oh, it's only the Mid-Ulster Cup, but silverware, there's nothing beats it. And that is the success that now they are building this on, Portadown. But listen, it is interchangeable. Some of the teams at the bottom, look at Newry City on Saturday. They lost out at home to Newington, and Barry Gray will know the extent and the scale and the scope of the task that is in front of him. But Newington coming down there to do a number. Okay, they had Rory Donnelly in the side. He had a point to prove. But the Newington should not be going to Newry and beating them in the Irish Cup if they're motivated. So it's the beauty of the Irish Cup. It's the beauty of cup football. But there's winners and losers. But I'm so glad to see 4 championship sides in the quarterfinals.
Well, you point out how perhaps the run that Portadown have had in cup competitions has helped them to be able to use that as momentum. As a part of my homework, I looked through all these cup victories Portadown, and as I've said in this podcast, like undefeated against Premiership opposition, undefeated now in all cup competitions. Look, I was at the game. Bangor ran them really close, and Niall's really hyped up the need to get those signings in. Zach Barr was key. He was the hero there for Portadown on Saturday. That was a fairly even affair when it came to the big chances, and it took the ability of Zach Barr to win that out for Portadown. And I talked last week, and I felt for Newry that game against Newington was bigger than just a one-off chance to get into the quarterfinals. If they're to survive, they're going to need to restart that engine and kick it up a gear, and you need to use these, what you might see as layups against teams in maybe a lower division, to try and build up that confidence. And that loss to Newington will do no good for that. They go into a massive game this weekend, and the Newington have been able to beat pretty much all of the top sides in the championship. I mean, they were at the top of the league for a bit before they fell away, but you add that extra player in Rory Donnelly, a player who hasn't had a great couple of seasons, and clearly he's gone there for the last couple of months of his Glentoran career. I don't think he'll play another game for Glentoran, at least he won't play on this contract, and he's going down there to pretty much do what he did on Saturday: be the main man, score the goals, and show everybody for next season, this is what I can do. And for Dungannon to lose to Ballyclare, you've probably seen them. They're a tricky side. If they play up to their ability, they can sneak results like this. They have players who can make the difference, like Ruhi, even though they lost McCurry. And unfortunately, I think they exposed exactly what Dungannon's big weakness is, and that is not being able to take control of games, letting teams run onto them, and it's just concentration at times at the back, just not matching the energy of the other teams at the key moment. And those teams in Newington and Ballyclare, it's the highlight of their season, no doubt. Unless things start to go very, very well between now and May in the championship.
Well, Stephen Small is, tactically astute. He knew it was a hit, basically going up there to Dungannon on Saturday. Did every opportunity, okay, they did go behind, but then every time they went over to the game, I had a sense that Ballyclare were going to do it. I've seen it back. They had that absolute belief in themselves, and you could see how much it meant to them. Now, the quarter final, I hope that it really does invigorate the town of Ballyclare. They'll come down to the Oval in big, big numbers, because I was up at I saw them playing Institute at the Brandywell, and they brought a couple of buses up. But Stephen has molded a team. You can see the way he actually interacts with the team. I was there on the first day of the season when they played Bangor. They got the victory that day. And just speaking to Stephen afterwards, and the way that the players had respect for him, they're playing his way. Now they're going to the Oval in the quarter final, a free hit, as they say. And oh, dare I say, if Ballyclare come away with a sort of result that day, and I think they're capable of it, it'll not be a nice atmosphere in the car park of the Oval, but that'll be one of the more intriguing ties.
Well, Glentoran were able to avoid a banana skin, and it looked like a rather inviting one to slip on, to be fair, down at the Bluebell. What an occasion there for Ballymacash, but they were well beaten. They were outclassed by a actually very hard working display from Glentoran. They didn't really give Ballymacash an inch. In fact, I think Ballymacash were a wee bit overawed by the occasion. They took the lead early and they didn't let that slip. And that'll be good for Warren Feeney, who's had a fair amount of heat from the fans, but recently he's getting results when it matters, and their season continues. They'll be fighting for Europe between now and the end of the season, and the Irish Cup is one way to do that, and I'm sure they'll look at Ballyclare and think that is a cracking draw for us, with the hope to continue on and do well. Elsewhere for the top flight teams, like we talked about momentum there, or at least I did, and Larne were able to continue the momentum they had by thumping Glenavon at home. That just looked like a training session for them. And I'm a wee bit delighted for Lee Bonus. I mean, he scores 2 goals. There's a penalty that goes their way. And it's Andrew Ryan stepping up to take that penalty kick. I'm sure there is protocol there that, look, the game is won there because Isaac Bird had been sent off. I'm sure there's protocol to say he was the designated player and he's the man to take it no matter what the situation. But I mean, if he did not get the hat-trick there and then, I could just tell, listening to that, thinking, no one is going to run harder and faster between now and the end of the game than Lee Bonus to get that hat-trick that he feel he should have got. And he did.
He did. Fair play to him. It was one of those games. It was a bit like the game at the Bluebell Stadium. It seemed to be a very clinical job Glentoran did there. And Larne were not going to be caught once they took the lead. And Bonus to actually be back in that goal scoring form is, dare I say, a bonus for Tiernan at this stage. But look, the Irish Cup's one of those competitions that Larne have not won. I would love to see them get to a final at Windsor Park. Be a great event for the town, following on from last year. And as I say, poor Newington. They thought they were going to get a big day out in the quarter final. They're going to play Larne on their own pitch, Inver Park, where they play. So it's one of those strange anomalies that the Irish Cup throw up.
Landlords versus tenants. Who's paying the lecky bill? I thought that was very funny.
Yes, indeed. But also, I want to mention about Institute Linfield, and there may be a bit of a problem there, because as Institute celebrated, I'm sure the PSNI in that part of the world were saying, oh, there's how are we going to get all the fans in and out, because Derry City are actually playing on the Friday night against St. Patrick's, so you can't have the game on a Friday night. On the
Big game as well.
Big game as well, yeah. On the Saturday, the Derry GAA are playing Dublin at 5 o'clock at Celtic Park, which is 100 metres above the Brandywell. So the police will not want 12,000 GAA fans and another soccer game ongoing. So there's 2 options. They either play that game at lunchtime on the Saturday, so as the fans can all be away from the Brandywell by the time the GAA fans arrive, or is there a prospect of a Sunday afternoon game between Linfield and Institute up at the Brandywell? So that's an intriguing. I'm sure we'll get an early sort of call on that there. But with Derry City season starting again, the Friday nights at the Brandywell is not an option, but I don't think the place would want to have an evening game. So it'll be interesting.
It's another aspect of that because you use the word intriguing, and I think you're absolutely right. Linfield going to play a competitive game at the Brandywell. There's a certain amount of significance with that. There's different context to it now in the year and the team. But there's obviously other considerations there. And to get through, it was a nice bounce back performance from Linfield. Wasn't particularly stellar. And you've got to feel perhaps after that result against Dungannon, they not totally blew away the cobwebs. They get the result against Ballymena. Ballymena will just have to shake that off and go, we give it a good go, and it looks as though they did. But it's not like they were at their absolute best, but that hardly matters. It's a cup competition, and Linfield win 2-0 against Ballymena at home. And then elsewhere, Cliftonville, I thought there could have been a shock here. They give it a go themselves, like all. But could this be the year now that they have championship opposition? They have to go to Shamrock Park. I guess it's probably the most difficult game out of all those championship sides, with the way they've been able to beat every Premiership side they've played against in Loughgall, Carrick, Glenavon, and the Crusaders. Do Cliftonville want to be the latest scalp there at Shamrock Park? That makes it a more dangerous game. Probably the most interesting tie of the entire round, foregoing, the significance of Linfield playing at the Brandywell. So another great performance from them, similarly to Larne. It just shows you that this Cliftonville side are a well-oiled machine and are an attacking threat. 4-0, and who's at the centre of it all? One of the men with Hale in their name.
Absolutely. And of course, Joe the goal, Gormley got the first goal. So it was a clinical display by Cliftonville coming up against Loughgall. I'll tell you one thing, Peter, is that I think back to Cliftonville going to Newry a number of weeks ago, a heavy pitch where the silky skills that this team is capable of producing. It took them 95 minutes to actually get a winner. Shamrock Park in the quarterfinal will be a heavy pitch against a motivated side, against an improving side. I'd say there'll be a big turnout from the Portadown fans that day. This is probably Niall's not do or die moment because he's a cup final coming up, but he will be relishing the thoughts of Cliftonville coming down.
Exactly. It just is not conducive to the style of football that they want to play. They'll really have to dig out in that game. And obviously it was at Shamrock Park for the radio there. And one of the things that was highlighted to me was that that's going to be a big week for Portadown. Like, they've had a tough out couple of years, and this cup run has really ignited the fan base there. But that, in the space of 7 or so days, on the second, if it is played on the second, they'll have a home tie in the quarterfinals to Cliftonville. The week after is their League Cup final against Linfield. So, I mean, that is a really season-defining 8 to 7 days there for the Mid-Ulster side. Look, as many people will point out, them getting out of the championship is their number one aim, and all these runs are not completely pointless, but it doesn't really add up to much if they're not playing top flight football next year. But when it comes to the pressure being on, but they're not really being much pressure at all for them because of the opposition they've got going on, I mean, that's why you play football, surely. Like, a top flight team would relish the opportunity of having a home quarterfinal and a final at the National Stadium the week after. But it's all these players that Niall's put together. That's an exciting week if you're a fan of the red team from Mid-Ulster.
Yeah, it's one of my favourite grounds to go to, Shamrock Park, because I know the same people who sit in the back row there beside me. They shake my hand every time they're going home and wish me well, and they have been through thick and thin with that club. I would love to see them getting a bit of success in one of those big cup ties. And I think they will come back. They will either finish first or second in the championship. They have that momentum, but this is a bonus for them. And I these people who have been following the Portadown side for so long, and they're an older generation, I think they would love to see a bit of major silverware at Shamrock Park.
I don't know what you're doing to charm these ones. Maybe they'll be nicer to me if I'm there for more victories like there was on Saturday for the Ports. Right, big podcast, but we're still going to do what we always do, and that's look ahead to this week's fixtures, back to porridge. And I mean, There's only so many games left of the season, and there's a few things to be sorted out in regards to what happens at the top, middle now, and bottom of the league. And I think this weekend, at least for me, the biggest fixture with the most writing on it when it comes to short term ramifications. I talked about it a bit last week. Ballymena, Newry. 6 points the difference right now. Both lost in the cup. Newry in less desirable fashion. I mean, this could be Newry's season in a box.
Yeah, it could. We're getting that. I don't know where time goes, Peter, because we're into February now. People are starting to think about the split and everything like that there. By the time we get another 2 months, this will all be done and dusted. But these are the crucial ties. And that one you pinpoint, you have two teams both out of the cup. They can concentrate on the league. Ballymena, for me, the impact that that would have on the club and the town, for them to be into a relegation situation, for me, Ballymena have always been a bit like Portadown, top flight side. Newry have yo-yoed up and down over those number of years. They nearly went out of business. But that game on Saturday, those two managers, Jim Irvin and Barry Gray, will be focused on that game because there is so much at stake. And it's getting to that point where you're running out of games. And this is where you need to actually make that statement. So that's an intriguing tie. Maybe Ballymena, because I look at the result last week for Newry and I see the defeat to Newington. Maybe that's giving, it's giving an insight into the deeper malaise that's within the club. Barry Gray was never going to have a magic wand. So basically, Friday night, that game is going to be do or die between those sides.
And there's a great opportunity for people to watch it. I mean, anybody that follows this league, I think it's going to be a fascinating fixture. It's a different kind of energy when we see these big battles at the top where trying to win, there's so much on the line. But when it comes to these players who going out of the division, it's a different kind of energy. And I agree with yourself. Like I saw that stat going about online, and it was Match of the Day talking about the amount of goals that Sheffield United have conceded, and they said that stat was the second worst amount of goals conceded by a top flight club in Europe. The worst top flight club, Newry. Newry, which must felt like a bit of a rubbing of the salt after the Saturday that was for Newry City. I mean, their backs are against the wall here. I'm sure they would take a draw and try and build up a little momentum, but time is running out and they kind of have to go for the jugular here. And I wonder how that will impact Ballymena, knowing a draw here, 6 points. If you try and go for it, we get caught. It's all of a sudden very close. But I mean, a win here, 9 points, that is huge, particularly with the amount of points these teams have only been able to forge themselves. I'm going to say I think Ballymena have been better. Not sparkling, but I think they're probably the favourites going into this. Especially that it is at the Newry Showgrounds, because it has not been a happy hunting ground for Newry. They haven't won there since October 2022. So it's a big game. And can Barry Gray get a performance out of one of these players and shake off that result on Saturday? We'll have to see. But I'm massively intrigued by that game. Elsewhere,
I was saying it's fascinating that Newry get name checked on Match of the Day. There must be something in the air about European records in that part of South Down and Armagh, because up the road, Loughgall are the smallest village to have a top flight team. So, all the publicity will take it in the Irish League. Absolutely.
well, they play on Friday night as well. They go to Inver Park. And look, Larne have only lost once this season, and it is by the hands of Loughgall. So if anybody has to feel like they can do it, it should be Loughgall. But I can feel them ever so slightly losing that kind of excitement about it. Not that they still don't have the skill and ability, but I mean they're more assured, and with that, perhaps other teams know what they're facing. They don't have that unpredictability that they maybe had at the start of the season. But I mean, Larne have Andrew Ryan scoring goals, Leroy Miller's scoring goals from midfield. You now see Lee Bonus. They'll be big parts of their season moving forward, and I think this will be another one of those Larne performances. I think it's probably a 2-0 victory for Larne, and they march on.
Yeah, I remember journalists used to say about going to watch Chelsea in the early 2000s at Stamford Bridge. It didn't matter what the game was like. Chelsea always won 3-0 at the end of the day. And I think it's getting to the point on a Friday night at Inver Park with Larne's absolute class and the momentum. you could be talking there 2-3 nil. Larne will not want to, they not want to exhaust themselves to get an early goal. And if they win 2-0 or 3-0, that's all Tiernan wants. But you're right about Loughgall. They've made their statement. We're coming towards the end of a long season. It's been a long season before that as well for Loughgall. So, yeah, you just know going to Inver Park on a Friday night, you're coming up against a team in form, a team of ability, and 2 or 3 nil is the way that I think that'll go.
We'll not dive too much into Glentoran and Cliftonville, the rearranged game from earlier on in the season. That will likely be played by the time you've listened to this podcast. But being said, we'll try and give it a bit of a go on how Cliftonville's games against Coleraine and Glentoran's game against Carrick Rangers will be. 2 home games in a row for Glentoran. Obviously, Cliftonville are a very difficult side. Every time Glentoran and Cliftonville meet, it's a feisty little affair. But for both of them, I've got to say for Glentoran against Carrick, they're not the best record against Carrick, but at home it's a different story. And for Cliftonville, they've got this slightly boosted Coleraine side because they did get a victory before the cup there. But I mean, it would be a very poor week for Cliftonville if they're not getting out of this week with 4 points at least. And I'm sure if they're going to drop points at all at home to Coleraine, to the standard they need to be meeting is not where they want to be doing that.
It's like they're a well-oiled machine, Cliftonville at Solitude, the way that Larne at Inver Park. They just know what way to play. They play at their own pace. They have their own passing game. And I could see them beating Coleraine very easily. On Saturday, if they get an early goal, it's been a horrible season, all said for Oran Kearney and Coleraine. Cliftonville and Jim Magilton, they can sense something this season. They're in the hunt. And yes, I put that as a win for Cliftonville. And Glentoran, when they're good, they're very good, but when they're poor, they're very poor. So let's see what Stuart King can do with his Carrick Rangers side. But yeah, that's another interesting one. But Glentoran will fancy their chances
because Carrick are gunning for one of these places in the top 6. They've talked about the amount of cup finals there, but I just think the quality and styles makes fights. I think Glentoran at the Oval should be able to pass round and outrun this Carrick Rangers side. But look, with the player formerly known as Danny Purkis and with Carrick Rangers, I mean, they can spring an attacking surprise on anybody. A bit like Newry, their problem has been keeping goals out elsewhere. First game of the final run of Stephen Baxter being in charge of Crusaders goes down to Dungannon. I mean, he has a clear aim between now and the end of the season. Win as many times as he can. Try and deliver Europe on a little silver platter. And look, it won't really impact when it comes to where they finish because they're not going to get, I think you can all predict, not going to be able to get into the top 3 positions to get them guaranteed Europe, depending on the cup. They're not in the cup. So, I mean, it's all about getting momentum now. And I think Dungannon will be a tough enough test, particularly at Stangmore. But as we saw last week, we don't know what side the Swifts can produce week to week.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the plastic, as I say, like the Glentoran, they're good. They're very good. Dungannon, I've seen them a few times this season. But, I mean, for a team like Ballyclare can come down and do a number on them at Stangmore Park. It's not a fortress. Stephen Baxter, he'll be sitting his team down, his players down, having a heart-to-heart about what he wants to achieve at the rest of the season. And that begins on Saturday at the Stangmore. And you'd imagine that he will bring a rejuvenated side and squad down there, and they'll want to be playing for him because, as a measure of their gratitude to Stephen for what he's done, they're going to play their part to ensure that his final few months in management of Crusaders are going to be a successful one, and his legacy is going to be secured, which it is anyway, but a European spot is what they're aiming for, and they'll do their best.
Crusaders' big problem recently has been scoring goals. The inclusion of Nixon from Queens via Carrick has been a nice addition. He was at the centre of things the last time they were playing top flight football. So look, if they can get a bit of a goal running going, good, because Dungannon can surprise teams, they can get goals, and the question for me is Crusaders, can they outscore? I think they will. 2-1 for the Cruise there, and a team that's also having difficulties up top themselves, scoring multiple goals, which you often need to do to build up a bit of steam as you surge the title. they're in first place. That's who you want to be. And they go against the Glenavon team, a sorry Glenavon team, after being well defeated by Larne. They're at home after all the talk in the paper of David Haley complaining about that Windsor Park pitch. We've heard that before. He gets his chance for a couple of away games. It starts at the lovely pitch of Mourneview. And if you want to fix your defensive troubles, I think Glenavon are probably the team, because, I mean, they have so many injuries at the back. Not helped by the red card for Isaac Bird, who was a bit of a makeshift centre-back. Danny Wallace got hooked pretty much for his performance, so he'll need to sharpen his act up if he is to start again on Saturday. I've said this a few weeks, Linfield need to score early, get the jitters out, and try and look like a controlling team again.
Yeah, I mean, it's been disappointing for Glenavon over the last number of weeks, because they had a good run of form, and now they seem to, you talk about the injuries and whatever, but I mean, their fans will go there on Saturday expecting a performance against Linfield, heavy pitch. What Linfield will turn up, the Linfield that played Dungannon, or the Linfield that is the polished machine. But that's why we go to football. That's why we report. That's why we spectate. And it'll be an interesting game at Mourneview. I wouldn't be surprised if Glenavon can just raise it enough. Maybe a draw. You never know. But all to play for on the heavy pitch.
I think that should be a Linfield victory there. And again, it would be a bit of a disaster, to be honest, just by the standards all these teams need to keep up, especially with Larne winning potentially on Friday to keep the pressure on everybody else. That really does play into their hands. So yeah, I think there'll be a 3-0 victory for Linfield, all going well for them. Barry, another big podcast, one of those ones, when a manager moves on, it's always a bit of a temple moment. It's amazing over the past almost 2 seasons of this podcast how many I've had to cover, particularly ones with long tenures. And look, you were only on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. I drafted you in to be the big heavy for this one, and with that, I'm sure people can see all the places that you do your work. They're probably well aware of that, so I've decided to change it up with the last couple of weeks of the season. And this will change for everybody, and I know that you see a lot of championship football, but for you, with the last somewhat third of the season to go, if I was to put you on the spot and say who so far has been your player of the season, your lame duck in situ Ulster player of the year, do you have one at the front of your lips?
Well, from a championship perspective, Oisín Devlin, who has signed more a pre-contract with Larne, young person at Institute, big future ahead. I'm so impressed with him. Such a brain on such a young shoulders. I haven't seen an awful lot of the top flight, to be truthful, but the Hales, there's so many names up there that are coming to the fore. Let's just say Lee Bonus is going to play a big role towards the end of the season for Larne. I think personally that they're going to retain that title. They have the momentum. So let's just see where it takes us. But I'm for Ballina-Mallard on Saturday, because Anna United and Portadown decide to go to half-5. So it's the run down to Fermanagh for me. But looking forward to it as usual.
Excellent stuff, Barry. A pleasure as always. I look forward to chatting to you very soon.
Thank you, Peter.
Hey, hope you're keeping well. Hope you're keeping all right. You're here at the very end. It's amazing actually looking back at just some of the episodes that I've done about managers leaving or significant ones leaving clubs, and it's like wild. I don't feel like I've been doing it for that long, but we've done a couple of these now, and I guess they're never fun for the manager, but it always adds a bit of intrigue, which I'm sure is why you listen, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you very much for going, hey, I want to hear what Peter and whatever guest he brings on has to say about this. And obviously you're here to the end, so you wanted to get a full circle on what's going on. And if you have got to this point and you don't happen to be following this podcast on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter, then guess what? I think you probably should. It's really easy. Doesn't matter what app you have open first, because I know you're going to do all three. Just search for @kickingmatch, all one word. You can contact me, kickingmatch@gmail.com. Again, if you're here, why don't you subscribe if you want to? No pressure. Via Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just go to the homepage of this podcast and there'll be a little button that'll let you subscribe, follow. It's free, and it means you get to keep up to date with all the most recent happenings in Kicking Match uploading. And I should have a juicy bonus 1 episode for you coming up pretty soon. Is that a tease? I think it's a tease. I'll leave you on that cliffhanger, and I'll see you sometime next week. Bye.